All right, everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to dive into something pretty intense.
Yeah.
U.S. tariff threats and what Canada can do about them. It's a bit of a high-stakes game.
Oh, absolutely. High stakes indeed.
With the Canadian economy hanging in the balance.
Yeah. We've got some dense reading material to get through today. Counter-tariff strategy lays out all kinds of potential responses.
Okay.
And then we've got diplomacy versus retaliation, which dives into, well,
as the name suggests.
exactly, diplomacy versus retaliation.
All right, so our listeners out there, you're here because you need to understand this situation.
Right.
Inside and out. So we're going to break down these options, figure out what factors might influence the best course of action for Canada.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, we got to lay some groundwork.
For sure.
These U.S. tariff threats, these aren't just empty threats, are they?
No, not at all. The U.S. has actually threatened to put a 25% tariff on everything coming from Canada and Mexico.
Wow.
And they've already increased tariffs on China. This isn't just about trade, you know? This is about power. This is about leverage. And there are some potentially huge consequences here.
Huge consequences. So why is this such a big deal for Canada specifically?
Imagine a giant pipeline between two countries pumping goods back and forth constantly. That's the U.S.-Canada trade relationship.
Right.
The U.S. is Canada's biggest trading partner by far.
Okay.
So a 25% tariff on everything would be like chucking a massive wrench into that pipeline.
That's a scary thought. So let's say you're Canada staring down the barrel of this tariff threat. What's the first move?
Right.
Well, our counter-tariff strategy source suggests starting with diplomacy and negotiation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like trying to defuse a bomb.
Right.
You don't just want to start cutting wires randomly.
Right.
You need to try and understand the mechanism and try to disarm it carefully.
Okay.
So in this case, that means engaging with the U.S., trying to find some common ground, and really highlighting the potential harm that these tariffs could do to both sides.
Right.
Don't forget, the North American economy is very intertwined. What hurts one part often hurts the whole thing.
Right. It's not just about winning or losing. It's about finding a solution that works for everyone.
Exactly.
And speaking of finding solutions, one tactic mentioned in counter-tariff strategy is leveraging U.S. stakeholders.
Yes.
What exactly does that mean?
So this is kind of like playing offense and defense at the same time.
Okay.
It means working with U.S. businesses, industry groups, even individual consumers who would be negatively impacted by these tariffs.
Right.
Because if enough people within the U.S. start pushing back against the tariffs, it puts pressure on their government to reconsider.
So it's about building alliances even within the country that's threatening the tariffs?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. It makes me think about all those farmers in the U.S. who rely so heavily on selling their products to Canada.
Right.
Hitting them with retaliatory tariffs would hurt, wouldn't it?
Absolutely it would. And that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
It really highlights how interconnected trade is. It's not just some abstract government policy, you know?
Yeah.
It's about real people's livelihoods on both sides of the border.
Okay, so we've got diplomacy. But what if talking it out just doesn't work?
Right.
Our source mentions legal action through international bodies like the WTO and the USMCA.
Yeah, that's option two, taking it to court, so to speak.
Okay.
Think of the WTO like the global referee for trade. You know, if Canada feels like the U.S. tariffs are violating international trade rules, they could file a complaint with the WTO.
Right.
And then there's the USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA,
Yeah.
which covers trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It's more of a regional agreement.
So choose your weapon, global court or regional court. But in counter-tariff strategy, they mention that WTO resolutions can be notoriously slow,
Yes,
sometimes taking years.
that's true. It can feel like justice delayed is justice denied,
Yeah.
especially when the economic impacts are immediate.
Yeah.
However, if the WTO does rule in Canada's favor, it would carry a lot of weight. It's not just about winning the case. It's about setting a precedent and showing that the U.S. isn't above the rules.
So there's a strategic element to it. It's not just about immediate relief. It's about playing the long game.
Exactly. It's about upholding a rules-based system. Because if countries start ignoring international agreements,
Right.
it could create chaos in the global trading system.
Okay, so we've explored diplomacy and legal action, but let's be honest, sometimes you got to fight fire with fire.
Right.
And that brings us to retaliatory measures.
Counter-tariff strategy calls this a measured and proportionate response.
Yeah, okay.
It's not about starting a trade war. It's about carefully choosing your targets to inflict maximum pain on the U.S. while minimizing the damage to Canada.
Right. It's about strategic targeting, like that example from diplomacy versus retaliation,
Yeah,
hitting agricultural products from those states that rely heavily on exporting to Canada.
exactly. It's about finding those pressure points, sending a clear message that we're not just going to take it lying down. This approach is often seen as a way to force the U.S. back to the negotiating table.
Right, but isn't there a risk that retaliation could escalate things, lead to a full-blown trade war?
There's always a risk.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And that's why this whole diplomacy versus retaliation debate is so important.
Yeah.
It's not about choosing one or the other. It's about understanding the pros and cons of each approach and finding the right mix.
So Canada's got some tough choices to make: diplomacy, legal action, retaliation, each with its own set of risks and rewards. But before we dive deeper into that debate, let's take a quick pause and give our listeners a chance to digest all this.
Sure.
All right, so we've laid out the options: diplomacy, legal action, retaliation. But what would these tariffs actually mean for Canadians? Like, let's get real about the potential impact.
Okay, well, let's think back to that pipeline analogy.
Okay.
If these tariffs really clog up that flow of goods between Canada and the U.S., the whole system starts to sputter. And the first casualty is likely economic growth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Canada's GDP could take a real hit.
Like, how much are we talking?
Potentially shrinking by a percentage point or more.
Okay, that's a significant number. So what's driving that?
Well, it's a chain reaction. Reduced access to U.S. markets means Canadian businesses, especially those that are heavily reliant on exporting to the U.S.,
Yeah.
they start to suffer.
Right.
Think about the auto industry, for example.
Uh-huh.
Parts and finished vehicles move back and forth across that border all the time.
Yeah.
You slap a 25% tariff on that, and things get expensive fast.
So it hits businesses first? Then what?
Then the ripple effect kicks in. If businesses are hurting, they might start laying off workers. Investment dries up.
Okay.
And consumers, seeing all this uncertainty, start tightening their belts. It becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
Fear about the economy actually makes the economy worse.
That's a grim picture.
Yeah.
And our diplomacy versus retaliation source points out that some sectors would be hit harder than others, right?
Well, for sure.
It's not going to be this like even pain across the board.
No, definitely not. Some industries are really deeply integrated with the U.S. market.
Like what?
Manufacturing, for example. The auto parts sector in particular, they rely heavily on these cross-border supply chains.
Yeah.
So we could see factory closures, job losses, entire communities struggling.
Wow.
Agriculture is another vulnerable sector. Canadian farmers depend on access to U.S. markets for things like grains and livestock.
Right.
Tariffs could really disrupt those flows and lead to lower prices.
And geographically, are some parts of Canada going to feel this more acutely than others?
Yeah, most definitely. Think about provinces like Ontario and Quebec, which have large manufacturing sectors that depend heavily on exports to the U.S.
Yeah.
They would be right on the front lines of this trade war.
So it's not just about abstract numbers like GDP. It's about real people losing jobs, businesses shutting down,
Right.
entire communities feeling the pinch.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for the Canadian government to have a multi-pronged approach. Not just figuring out how to respond to the U.S., but also how to support those industries and those regions that are most vulnerable to the fallout.
It makes those long-term strategies like diversifying trade partners and boosting domestic innovation seem even more urgent, doesn't it?
It absolutely does,
Yeah.
because if this situation teaches us anything, it's that putting all your eggs in one basket can be pretty dangerous.
Right.
Building a more resilient Canadian economy means spreading the risk. Counter-tariff strategy has some good ideas on how to do that.
Yeah, it mentions forging stronger trade ties with the European Union, for example, or tapping into those booming markets across Asia.
It's about finding new customers for Canadian goods and services, attracting foreign investment, creating jobs that aren't so dependent on what's happening in the U.S. market.
And on the innovation side,
Yeah.
it's about investing in research and development, supporting entrepreneurs, creating an environment where Canadian businesses can compete on a global scale.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond just extracting resources and manufacturing basic goods. It's about developing cutting-edge technologies, fostering creative industries, building a knowledge-based economy that can really thrive in the 21st century.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the potential downsides. But is it all doom and gloom?
Right.
Could there be any silver linings to this whole tariff mess?
It's funny you should ask that, because sometimes a crisis forces innovation.
Okay.
While the short-term pain from these tariffs would be undeniable, this situation could actually push Canada to make some changes that have been needed for a long time.
So like a wake-up call.
Exactly. Take that over-reliance on the U.S. market, for example. This could be the catalyst to finally diversifying those trade relationships.
Okay.
It could force Canadian businesses to become more efficient, more innovative, and more competitive on the global stage.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
It really is. And this isn't just about economics either. It's about national resilience.
Yeah.
Canada has a history of pulling together during tough times. This situation could foster a sense of national purpose, a determination to prove that we can overcome these challenges and come out stronger on the other side.
I love that perspective. So amidst all this uncertainty, there's also this potential for positive change.
Right.
It's a reminder that even in difficult times, there are opportunities to be found if we're willing to look for them.
Absolutely. It's about adapting, innovating, finding new ways to thrive. And it's a conversation that we need to keep having.
We sure do, because this tariff saga is far from over.
Yeah.
As we move into part 3 of our deep dive, we're going to zoom out even further and explore those geopolitical ramifications of this whole situation.
Okay.
What does this mean for Canada's relationship with the U.S. and its place in the world? Stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've talked about potential moves Canada could make. We've talked about the economic shockwaves these tariffs could trigger. But now let's step back and look at the bigger picture.
It's time to put on our geopolitical glasses. Because this isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about power. It's about alliances. It's about the future of global trade.
And at the heart of it all is this question. What does this whole tariff situation mean for Canada's relationship with the U.S.?
Right. I mean, they're our closest ally, our biggest trading partner, but things feel a little shaky right now.
It's like that old saying, when America sneezes, Canada catches a cold. But what happens when a Himika throws a punch? This situation has definitely introduced some tension into the relationship. There's a sense of betrayal almost, like the U.S. is acting like a bully, not a partner.
And it's not just about hurt feelings, right? There are real consequences to this erosion of trust.
Oh, absolutely. For decades, the Canada-U.S. relationship has been built on this foundation of predictability, this assumption that we're in it together. But these tariffs, along with other protectionist moves by the U.S., are shaking that foundation.
Okay.
It makes Canadian businesses hesitant to invest in cross-border trade.
Yeah.
It makes policymakers question whether they can really rely on the U.S. as a stable partner. And this kind of plays into this much bigger global trend, doesn't it? This whole rise of protectionism, this America First mentality. It's not just about Canada.
Exactly. The U.S., under its current administration, seems to be turning away from multilateralism. That idea of working together with other countries to solve problems.
Yeah.
Instead, they're taking a more unilateral approach. They're prioritizing their own interests above all else.
And that has ripple effects across the whole global trading system.
Think of it like a spider web.
Okay.
The U.S. is at the center, and all these threads of trade connected to other countries. When the U.S. starts tugging at those threads, the whole web vibrates.
Wow.
It creates uncertainty. It creates instability. And it creates this sense that the rules of the game are changing.
So where does Canada fit into all of this? We've always been such a strong advocate for free trade, for multilateralism, for working within the system. But what happens when the system itself is under threat?
That's the million-dollar question. Canada is at a crossroads.
Yeah.
Do we cling to the old ways, hoping that the U.S. will eventually come back to the table?
Right.
Or do we adapt, forge new alliances, and chart a more independent course?
Counter-tariff strategy touches on that, right?
Yeah.
Talking about the need for Canada to diversify its trading partners, to not put all its eggs in the American basket.
It's about hedging your bets.
Yeah.
Spreading the risk. Strengthening ties with the European Union, for example.
Right.
They're a major economic bloc with shared values and a strong commitment to free trade. And then there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade agreement with 11 countries across the Pacific Rim.
So building bridges to new markets. Finding new customers for Canadian goods and services. But it's also about more than just economics, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. It's about forging alliances with countries that share Canada's values.
Right.
Finding partners who believe in multilateralism in diplomacy, in a rules-based international order. Because if the U.S. is stepping back from that role, someone needs to step up.
And maybe that someone could be Canada.
It's not about replacing the U.S. It's about playing a more assertive role on the global stage. It's about using our influence to promote free trade, to advocate for human rights, to be a voice for reason in a world that sometimes seems to have lost its way.
I find that incredibly inspiring. It's a vision of Canada as a leader, not just a follower.
Exactly. And it's not just some idealistic dream either. Canada already punches above its weight in international affairs.
Yeah.
We have a strong reputation for diplomacy, for peacekeeping, for being a fair and reliable partner.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they try to navigate this complex world of tariffs and trade wars?
I think this whole tariff situation is a wake-up call.
Yeah.
It's a sign that the old rules no longer apply.
Yeah.
It's a challenge, yes. But it's also an opportunity for Canada to redefine its role in the world.
To become more resilient, more independent, more confident on the global stage.
Precisely. And as we've seen, there are concrete steps that Canada can take to do this.
Right.
Diversifying trade partners, boosting domestic innovation, investing in strategic industries.
It's about building a stronger Canada, both economically and diplomatically.
And that's something worth fighting for.
This has been an incredible journey. We've explored tariffs to potential economic fallout, diplomacy, retaliation, and the big picture of Canada's place in the world. We hope you, our listeners, feel equipped to not just understand this issue, but to engage with it, to form your own opinions, and to be a part of shaping the future of Canada's trade and foreign policy. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.